Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Charlie Stevens with another guitar lesson for you. Today we're getting into some music theory, which to some people is sort of like a scary word or something, but it really isn't. It's really pretty simple. You just have to go slow and take your time with it and learn a little bit at a time. So that's what we're going to do on this channel. We're going to learn a little bit at a time, okay? So today we're going to learn about what I call the musical alphabet, and that's really the most important part about music theory, because the musical alphabet is the system of how we name our different notes and tones that we have on the guitar, right? So another name for that is the chromatic scale. It's kind of a fancy name that refers to a scale that includes all the notes. But the musical alphabet, that's kind of how we label these things. We'll talk about the chromatic scale at another point in time, but just so you know, we're sort of talking about that now too, okay? So anyway, musical alphabet uses letters from our English alphabet. So it starts on A, and it goes all the way through G, and it uses those 7 letter names. We don't use H, we don't use anything beyond G, okay? Now we also have sharps and flats, okay, and those are called accidentals. We'll talk in a moment about what accidentals are, but those will sort of factor in too, okay? But really we have 7 different letter names. And the reason we need the sharps and flats is because we actually have 12 different notes in our Western music scale before the notes start to repeat themselves, okay? So most things have an accidental in between their natural notes, but some notes do not, okay? So we have a note called A natural. It could be this one on our A string of our guitar, right? Open A, we call that A natural. Okay, the next letter in the English alphabet is B, of course, right? So you'd think maybe the very next note would be B, but actually it's not. We actually call this one A sharp, okay? A sharp, and that's actually called a half step. So a half step is the smallest distance we have in our Western music system. In our lessons on bends, we learned that we could kind of play notes that are in between the frets. Those, for purposes of written music, generally sort of don't exist. We sort of don't really acknowledge those, even though obviously they do exist. We can kind of play between the frets, but we don't really give those ones their own name when we're in our Western musical system, okay? So for our purposes, the very next note from open A, right here on the first fret of the A string, okay? Half step above. Okay, if we went 2 frets, well, that's 2 half steps. 2 halves makes a whole. So we actually call that distance, that's 2 frets away, a whole step. And that's why it got us to our next whole letter away, B. So A is here, B is here on the 2nd fret. So what was in between? What was this thing on the 1st fret then? Well, we call that A sharp, okay, because it's higher than A. It's sharper. So to sharp something, it's sort of a verb. It means to make the note a little bit higher in pitch. Exactly 1 fret higher, exactly 1 half step higher. That's what it means to sharp something. So if we sharp A, we're here. Okay, so A sharp is actually the name of this note. Now, when we get into these, it's a little tiny bit tricky because of the way written music notation works. Our lines and spaces represent different letter names. They don't really represent the sharps and flats without the use of these additional symbols, right? So it's A sharp, but we actually have a different name for it as well. We could call it by its flat name. Okay, so to flat something means to lower it in pitch by exactly 1 fret or 1 half step, right? So let's see, if I lowered it and I flatted this note, it would just be A natural, right? But what if I were higher? We said that this was B on the 2nd fret, right? We continue on our alphabet. B. I can flat B. Okay, we call that B flat. So this note could either be called A sharp, because it's sharper than A, or it could be called B flat because it's flatter, or lower in pitch, because to flat something is to lower it in pitch, right? So we could also call it B flat. So it's kind of weird. That one gets two different names. And we call that an enharmonic. An enharmonic, it's when it's the same note that has two different names. Kind of like when a word sounds the same, but has two different spellings, like the word two could be T-O, T-W-O, T-O-O, right? So similar to that, where it's going to sound the same, but we could call it different things. Now, the explanation for why we call it certain things has to do with scales. When we learn about how scales are constructed, we're going to have certain names for them. We'll talk about that at another point. One thing that's really good to do when we're getting into this is we'll just call them all sharp when we're going up. Because if I go to A and then I go to A sharp, that's pretty easy. I know I was at A, I know I add sharp, and I'm going up. I don't have to think A, okay, think ahead to B and then flat it, so the next one is B flat. For me, that's a little bit harder. Sometimes I might have to do that if I'm in a key that has a B flat in it, but that's a more advanced thing that we're not worried about right now. So what we're going to do is just go up the A string, and we're going to list every single note in the musical alphabet, and after we list the natural notes, we'll list a sharp after them. Now, there is an exception to this. Actually, there's two exceptions to this, because there are two natural notes that just do not have a sharp after them. They go right to the next natural note. And we're going to look at this on the piano as well, where we can see how this works on the piano. It visually makes a bit more sense on the guitar, but for now we'll just have to sort of understand that between the note B and C, there is no sharp. There's no sharp after B. So that means that there's no flat before C, really, right? It goes right from B is here on the second fret, the very next note, C. Okay? The other exception is the note E. We don't have an E sharp, we go right to F. So E and B have no sharp. Ernie and Bernie, or Bert and Ernie, or however you want to think about it. Those two notes have no sharp. You can just kind of memorize that. We have the symbol to make anything sharp though, right? So technically we could write a sharp symbol in front of a B and make that sharp, but you'd just be playing a C. Okay, so that's a little bit confusing, and we're not quite ready to tackle that. So for our purposes right now, B sharp doesn't really exist. It's not a place on our guitar, it's not a place on our piano. Okay, if we encounter in the future, we'll tackle that as needed. But for right now, just kind of, we just need to know it's sort of not there, okay? So we go from B straight to C. Now our normal rules resume, because the C, well, that's not Bert or Ernie, that's not B or E, so that's got a sharp after it. So here's C on the 3rd fret, here's C sharp on the 4th fret. That's the very next note in our musical alphabet. Okay, after C sharp, we resume in our regular alphabet. The note that comes after the letter C, the letter that comes after the letter C is D, right? So here's C, C sharp, next letter in the alphabet is D. Does this one have a sharp after it? Well, it's not Ernie or Bernie either, it's Durney, right? Which is silly, nobody says Durney, so definitely doesn't have a, follow that rule, right? So it does have a sharp, it's D, and then we'd have D sharp here. Okay, what comes after D in the alphabet? E, right? So D, not E yet, because we had a D sharp. Now we're at E. Okay, do you remember anything about E? Was that one of the funny ones? It was. That one does not have a sharp after it. So that means if we go 1/2 step higher, 1 fret higher from E, we're at the next letter in our alphabet, which is F, right? A, B, C, D, E, F. And don't be afraid to count through the alphabet if you need to remember this stuff. I sing that song in my head sometimes if I need to. Okay, so now we're at F. No sharp between E to F. Now F does have a sharp after it. So that means if I go up 1 more fret, now I'm here at the 9th fret of the guitar. That's called F sharp. Okay? F sharp. Now after F comes the next letter of the alphabet, G. So in between was F sharp. But here, 1 more higher, that's a G. Okay, good. Then we keep going. G, 1 fret higher than G. G sharp. Okay, what happens after G sharp? Didn't I say G was the end of it? We started at A, we went to G. Yup, so it starts over at A again. Apparently in Germany they go all the way up to H, and apparently that's actually where B flat is. So if anybody knows the German system, they want to leave a comment and explain to me how that works, that'd be great, because I've always been confused about how they work in the letter H, but apparently they do. But here in America, we don't acknowledge an H, and after G sharp, it all starts over and we go right back to A, which actually is called an octave. We learn about octaves when we discuss intervals, okay? But an octave means it's an A to another A, a little bit higher. In this case, we have A at 220 hertz to A at 440 hertz, which is exactly doubled. We doubled the frequency, so it sounds kind of the same, but it's twice as fast. The string, that is, it's vibrating twice as fast, which produces a higher sounding pitch. So exactly twice as fast produces sort of the same pitch, but an octave higher. So that has to do with a little bit more advanced stuff than what we're talking about now. But anyway, there's only 12 notes, as I mentioned earlier. We've done them all now. Now that we're at the 12th fret, we start it over. Okay? So that's our musical alphabet. A through G, but in between most of those, we have sharps and flats. Which ones do we not have sharps after? B and E. Okay, so if B and E have no sharp, that means that 2 have no flat, right? So let's see, what's next to B? B doesn't have a sharp, so that means we go straight to the next letter of the alphabet, which is C. So that means that C doesn't have a flat. Okay, E doesn't have a sharp, so if right next to that is the next letter of the alphabet, then the letter F, then that means that F doesn't have a flat. Okay? I know that through knowing the first way. B and E have no sharp. Then I do it just like I just walked through it, and I remember that those 2 have no flats. I don't really necessarily have that memorized down cold. Just so you know, you might want to choose one way or the other to make more sense to you. But, if one's true, the other is true as well, okay? So now that we're here, we're going to go back down our string. We're going to go backwards through our musical alphabet, because that's very important in music too. We'll go up, we'll go down. We need to know how this works in both directions. So now that we're here, we're going to descend the string. And this time, we're going to call them all by different names. All of the accidentals, that is. So remember, accidentals is the word we use to describe sharps and flats, versus the regular notes, which we actually call natural notes. So natural notes are just a way of saying we're not talking about A flat, I'm not talking about A sharp, I'm talking about A natural, plain old A. Okay, so the way we called this next note on the 11th fret when we went up to it, we called that G sharp. So if I went backwards, that's almost a little bit trickier, because I got to know I'm on A, and then I got to think, okay, what comes before A? Well, nothing, because that's the beginning of the alphabet. Oh yeah, I got to start back at the end of our musical alphabet. What was that again? G. Oh yeah, G has a sharp in front of it, so this is G sharp. So that's a little bit of a longer thought process than going A flat. So that's a different name for G sharp. If this is confusing you, don't worry, it'll become clear in time. It sounds funny when you're saying it, but it'll totally make sense as we go, okay? So we're going to call this one A flat this time, and all of those weird ones we'll call it by their flat name, because it'll just be a little easier to keep track. So let's start together. 12th fret of A. 11th fret is A flat. Okay, now we're at the beginning of the alphabet. We got to go back to the end of the musical alphabet, G. So here comes G natural, the 10th fret. Okay, G has a flat. So here on the 9th fret is G flat. We called that one F sharp before. Also true. We're calling it G flat. Here's F natural. Here's the 8th fret. Okay, now next is going to be E, because there's no sharp or flat between E and F. Those notes are right next to each other. F has no flat in one way of describing it, so we'd go right from F on the 8th fret to E natural here on the 7th fret. E does not have a sharp. Does it have a flat? Yeah, it absolutely does. It's actually one of the first flats we encountered. It's sort of an important flat, actually. But anyway, E, 6th fret here, 1/2 step lower than E, is called E flat. Okay, we called it D sharp before, of course, because it's in between D and E, but it's E flat in our way of talking about it right now. Now we go down again, D natural, okay. Down one more half step. On the 4th fret we have D flat, okay. Backwards through the alphabet to C, C natural here on the 3rd fret. Does C have a flat? No, because B has no sharp, that means C has no flat. They don't have a thing in between them, so we go right to B. So B has no sharp. Does it have a flat? Yes, this is the first flat we come to when we start adding flats to key signatures. So this is a very important flat. We usually call this B flat more oftentimes than we call it A sharp actually, but you don't need to worry about that right now. You just need to know that those mean the same thing. A sharp and B flat are the same thing. So that's here on the 1st fret. And back to the open string. That's our A again. Okay, so that's the musical alphabet. A through G. Everything has a sharp after it except for E and B. Okay? And every time you go from one of those to the next, you're going 1 half step, which is the smallest distance without doing a little bend in between those notes. The smallest distance you can go is a half step. So that's kind of what we're discussing. The musical alphabet, now we have a label for all the notes. If I kept going up here, it would just be the same again. If I did that on different strings, I'd just be starting at a different place in that sequence. But that's very linear, and I think that's very important to understand in guitar. I think it's a very important kind of concept to get, right? Because we have notes that are lower, we have notes that are higher. The layout on the guitar goes from lowest to highest this way, and then lowest to highest this way. It's sort of a grid, and then different strings start over in different places. So some of the time it doesn't really look that it's as linear as it really is, but all this stuff is. You can see it on just one string, right? I could also change strings. See, I didn't go anywhere. Now I ran out of strings to change, so I have to go up one string linearly. Okay, again, that's more usually referred to as the chromatic scale. Now I'm playing different scales and fingerings and exploring playing all the notes. Okay, so that's a different challenge of learning how to do that on the guitar as well. But first we need to know what the heck we're doing. What are these letter names called? Why are they sharps and flats and stuff? All that will make more sense when we talk about reading music, actually. Really, the system comes from the written page and translating that into the way we communicate about it and things. So I would encourage you to get into reading music a little bit to help you understand some of these concepts, even if you don't plan to be a really proficient orchestra sight reader or anything like that. It's still kind of a good idea. And we'll get into how to do that in future lessons. Right now, I'd like to show you how some of this looks on the piano so we can get a different viewpoint that's a little bit more linear and visually logical than the guitar appears at first. But it all is the same concepts that can actually be applied to any instrument. So I really feel like this is the cornerstone of all music theory, understanding what collection of notes we're working with, and from there we can understand other things about how to arrange these notes in ways that sound good, right? Okay, so thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to seeing you again in the next one.